Zone 2 training for menopause? Is this the solution for fat loss for your clients? And if so, why? If not, why not? Look, everybody is talking about Zone 2 training. It's all the rage. What is it? First, it's important to understand that I use 5 training zones. Other sources and other coaches use 6, still others use 4 and 7 zones. So we are already not talking about the same thing. So it's so much easier to share this in a feels like description, especially when you're talking to your clients. Look, I recently had a question from a client. What zone should I be in when I'm doing intervals? My answer needed to be very intuitive because my answer could have backfired. And here's how. Say I tell her you need to be in zone 4 and 5. Those are the zones for HIIT intervals. And by the way, this is true. Alternated again with zone 1 for recovery, right? With that answer, what's she going to do? Very likely, she's never been tested using the mode of exercises that she's planning to use. Maybe it's treadmill or a bike, for instance, for her training, for her high intensity interval training. And instead, what she's going to do is use an age related chart predicting her ranges for those zones. And this could be so wrong. For adults over 40, this kind of age-related prediction, even if, yes, I know you're saying, but I learned an age-adjusted prediction. Yeah, still, it's not a human. And, I'm 59. And if I tested and another or 5 other 59-year-old women tested, we're going to come up with different heart rate outcomes from that test. And that means that any percentage that just is pencil to paper or calculator, whatever, is not going to fit any one of the 5 of us potentially. So for some, it would be too high. For some, it would be too low. For very, very few, because you, sister, are not average, is not going to fit anybody. And this is really problematic. And we knew this, but we didn't know it as much as we do now. I mean, what prediction is going to help both men and women and young and old in the same way? Probably nothing, right? I mean, the commonsensical piece of that is that probably none. But what's really important is now that we know so much more about not only training men versus training women very differently, but as you're going through a major hormonal change in your life, it's not even just a cyclical, okay, week 1 to week 2 to week 3 to week 4, we need to kind of look at variations there. But now we're looking at, we were at one point coming into, regular menstruation, and now we're going out of it. And these are the 2 biggest changes in our lives. And I know you may be saying, what about pregnancy? Okay, yeah, big change. However, we have nailed that one because it's happened over and over for decades, and it hasn't been taboo, right? So since 1995 was the year, 1994 was the year I was pregnant. And what a long year that was. Okay. And at that point, I was bucking the system and almost collaborated, but I was in my 7th month as we were having these discussions, collaborated with a high risk baby doctor, basically. And unfortunately, we just ran out of time. But what our intention was to show what is healthy exercise. But that's, how long ago is that? A very long time ago. And yet we still don't talk about menopause with any reason. So it's challenging. This is really important to understand. So even when somebody tested and a knowledgeable coach has interpreted and determined their ranges, for anyone trying to use heart rate to see if they reach the right intensity during, say, 20-second bursts of exercise, a monitor is typically measuring what happened in the past, not the actual what it is right now. I mean, it's almost ridiculous to say, oh, I'm going to stare at my heart rate monitor to see if I get my heart rate up high enough to see if I stop. Well, listen, if you get breathless, you're there. Your client is there. So we need to, okay, use the tools we have available, but don't abuse the tools. Or maybe better said, don't abuse your intelligence. Your feels like is so much better at times. And you want to make sure you empower your clients that way as well. So we've got challenges with different sets of zones. We can't compare apples to oranges if we're talking about, zone 3 or zone 2 or zone on a 4 versus a 7 scale. We're going to get some skewed pieces here. So let's dive into that a little bit. We've also got challenges with predicted and tested zones, and we've got fundamental challenge with fat burning zone myths that still linger. So this episode, long, lengthy intro, I know, but it's going to focus on understanding fat burning, when and how it happens at each level of exercise, and 2, understanding the best application of types of fat burning exercise for women in midlife that you may be working with. I'm Deborah Atkinson. You're listening to She Means Fitness Business, and I mean you. This is a division of Voice for Fitness where I support you, health coach and personal trainers. And at Voice for Fitness, we know that you, if you're listening to this podcast, want to be an inspirational example to other midlife women. And in order to do that, you have to have a profitable health and fitness coaching business. Let's face it, money, revenue, power like that gives you leverage and gives you a voice. And the problem usually is a lack of clients or lack of revenue because you're not charging enough. And that can make you feel uncertain about whether you can succeed. And I know this because I've been in your shoes. Even at 49, like gutting my life in my business and starting over really to build from scratch, really solo. That's why I train fitness pros internationally now. And here's how we do it. First, we have to get you more clients. Second, we need to make sure that the revenue that you're getting coming in is profitable. It's not just paying the bills only and helping you get by. And then we have to make sure you maintain or create, if you don't have it now, freedom. Freedom of time is really one of the things we all value when we want to work for ourselves. So you can book a call. We can talk about, are you ready to take a next step with training with a mastermind or with private business coaching? But meanwhile, get the health and fitness professionals business scorecard. You can self-assess in about 3 minutes and find out where the holes that you have and you need to plug. So you can stop feeling like your dream is slipping away while other less qualified and heart-centered influencers make sales and get more clients. And instead, you could easily increase your revenue by about $5,000 a month in the first 90 days. If you're already there, consider about 25% increase in your revenue by the end of the year. It's doable. Okay, let's dive back into this episode. And I really want to break this down because as you hear, it is so easy because it's so sexy to jump on the bandwagon and hear everybody talking about zone 2 is working for me. And it very well might be, but I want to tell you that I'm hearing functional doctors talk about this. I'm hearing naturopaths talk about this and physician's assistants talk about this. Potentially that it's working for them and they're in midlife and they're telling their clients, but they really don't know and they're not sharing the dirt. Like zone 2 doesn't have any meaning for anyone. And when they do explain it, they're often using age predicted or age adjusted predicted heart rate ranges, which also are wrong. And then we have to factor in how does somebody feel and whether or not this is the right zone. So let's talk about the theory behind zone 2 for support with fat burning. So first of all, let's go really back to science. And the answer is yes. The question is, which burns more fat, low intensity or high intensity? And I said the answer is yes. They both do, but it's a matter of how fast do you want to burn it. But for midlife women, it is also a factor of where are you now? If you're a woman who's struggling in burnout, high intensity exercise is probably just going to make that worse, at least right now. Do we want to eventually get you there? Yes, probably. Then there's going to be a point where that is better. Long and slow is probably not good. And that has kind of always been the go low, go slow, go long, go slow. Let's consider short and low. And that being the solution, because often it is just getting regular movement. What are we calling it now? Movement snacks. And that means just little bits and pieces. Let's fit it in. Let's get it in. And that's not just for somebody busy. That may be for somebody in adrenal fatigue who needs this, stabilize your blood sugar with a little bit here and a little bit there and a little bit here later today. And that may be far better for smoothing out the bumps and supporting hormone balance. And then we can move into somewhere else when we're stable with that hormonal balance. So think about this, come back to the physiology for me. Exercise at low intensities burns a high percent of fat. So what happened when you were in the 80s, maybe still in the 90s, I think? I don't know, because I had gotten off the equipment at that point mostly. But you get on a treadmill, you get on an elliptical, or you get on a bike, it will tell you, here's your range. This is where you should be based on your age. Right? Here's your fat burning zone, and here's your, other zone. And it made fat burning is the best zone, right? That was quote unquote, supposedly like, don't let your heart rate get too high because then you won't be burning fat. People said things like that. Oh my gosh. So if you are exercising at lower intensities, you're burning a higher percent of fat. Let me just tell you this. Now, you may be moving. I hope you are going for a walk or you're doing your lifting. That is often when I will listen to podcasts, and you're probably a kinesthetic learner, so it's a great idea. But here's the deal. If you're sitting, as I am while I'm recording this, you're burning a really high percent of fat. But we have to look and say, how well is that working for you? While you're sleeping, you're probably burning 99.9% fat because you're not doing anything else. And your body can do that really easily. And when you work harder, you turn up the motor, your body is like, I don't have enough energy to go into fat stores to get it. So I'm going to just take it out of your liver and your muscle and use what's readily accessible, or what you're feeding it. If you're snacking or you've got clients snacking on a regular basis, there is no need for going into fat storage. But at low levels, yes, you can burn more fat for fuel, but you've got to really think about this. What's the total calories burned? If we say you have 20 minutes of time, and if we said, I want you to go for a slow walk for 20 minutes, or B, I want you to do high intensity interval training for 20 minutes, who's going to burn the most calories during that 20 minutes? I think you would all agree high intensity exercise is going to burn the most calories. Which one burns the highest percentage of fat? Fat for fuel, let's be clear, in the lower intensity, but overall fat, high intensity exercise. How? Because the number of calories goes way up with high intensity interval training. And even though we may have to slide it down, we're no longer burning, say, 50 or 60% fat like we do going slow. Maybe it's 30 to 40% of fat that we've shifted to as we do high intensity interval training, but it's 30 to 40% of a really big number in comparison is still going to be a bigger number of fat. And that is not even the end of the story. So let's talk about EPOC. Am I taking you back to exercise physiology courses and or to your certification? You're thinking excess post oxygen consumption, EPOC, or what we call in lay terms, the afterburn. The afterburn from any exercise that causes you stress somehow in your body, cardiovascular stress, muscle damage and repair, that kind of stress. anything that causes you excess stress, whether it's because it's really high intensity or because it's long duration or it's somewhere in the middle, that is going to have a greater afterburn effect. The number of calories that you burn coming back down to rest and recovery and homeostasis. It's not like jumping off a cliff, like, oh, I'm exercising at a really high level, burning a lot of calories and using more fuel, and then boom, I stop. Even though if you might do a cool down, and let's say we just want our clients to do that, but you don't just come back to homeostasis and now you're at rest again. No, you slowly come down that hill. And the higher the hill, right? So with a slow walk, how high is that hill? It's really not. Like it's a little rolling lift in your yard. Done. And so your recovery from it really doesn't take almost anything. But if you are doing really high intensity interval training, your recovery from that causes some micro tears in the muscles, causes more respiratory stress. And that all takes more recovery. And it might take 24, it might take 48 hours, depending. Now, marathon runners, depending on that. And that's not necessarily a recommendation, certainly if we're talking about midlife women or women in menopause, but that's a lot of stress over a long period of time. And recovery often takes days or weeks. So often the association for people who have done a marathon is if it took you 7 hours, and for some it does. That's kind of a walking pace for a lot of people, but then you want to wait at least 7 days before you do any real high intensity work because there's a lot of stress and strain and repairs to do, and everybody uses a different rule of thumb. And some will say, wait that many weeks, but there is a little association there. Because if you're running your marathon in 3 hours or 2.5, right, you are really fit. You didn't get there just by accident. And so your recovery probably doesn't take as long because of the fitness level and your body's ability to adapt. But I'm going to get off that roller coaster here and come back to again, to restate, exercise at lower intensities burns a higher percentage of fat, but exercise at high intensities burns a low percentage of fat, but burns calories at a very high rate. So by comparison, it's possible to train it a way that allows the body to gradually use fat at higher and higher intensities. When we're talking about eating and exercise, it takes both, but it's, becoming fat adapted. If you go into a lab, and you have to do this in a lab with a cart and really monitor and look at where's the crossover, like where is your crossover point where you're burning fat for fuel and then your intensity goes up and it's like dramatically your lines will cross, like use of carbohydrate just went up and use of fat just dramatically plummets. And for a beginner, somebody who's not very fit, that happens very quickly. For somebody who's much more fit, it happens later. So further out to the right on the graph, you'll see that crossover point. And with someone who's tried and consciously tried to become more fat adapted, they probably have done a lot of training at very low levels, potentially watching what they're doing with fuel sources and making sure that they still have their recovery, but they're using a little bit more fat for fuel, a little bit less carbohydrate, and putting in a lot of base time, but gradually beginning to bump up the intensity at that base time so they can still stay in that fat burning zone for longer. When you're a marathon runner and you can do that, that means you don't risk the gut disturbance of having to eat before you run out of fuel. I mean, carbohydrate stores being what they are for a lot of us because we eat more than we need, you could last a long time. However, we tend to deplete because we're inefficient. We're not necessarily exercisers used to training like athletes. And yet, if we were reliant on fat, we could go for days and days. It would be the water, the hydration that is the issue, and or electrolytes and that kind of a problem. So here's what happens. If you're exercising, and many of us, probably are guilty, even though we know this, but many of our clients will do this, say, go out for a run, and they will tell you, I feel really good. And so I just kept going. And what happened is they were no longer maybe doing a recovery run because their heart rate began to drift up the longer they went. And instead of monitoring their heart rate, because our perception, I know we want to train them to, hard is hard. And when you're breathing hard, then you're working hard. But if you're not breathing hard, maybe you're not working hard. It also can backfire when you're doing long endurance exercise. But usually, if they're honest, many of those exercisers would say, there's a point where if I'm going for a really long time, I actually can't hold a good conversation anymore. It is getting harder because of dehydration, because of total kind of cumulative effect of that exercise. But their heart rate is gradually coming up because it's, number one, they are somewhat dehydrated. So as the blood gets thicker, circulation gets harder. And there's, a little bit more respirational stress. There's more oxidation going on, and the muscles are getting a little bit more tired and having to turn over and over again. All of that will elevate heart rate. That it's got to work harder to make the same quote unquote ease of pace continue to go. And if that heart rate is not the controlling factor, if they don't hold it down, they've already reached that crossover effect. And now they're burning more carbohydrates, even though it feels like this is supposed to be an endurance run in a very low level. So this is where, when sometimes a shock when training, like for triathlon or marathon training, that some of the best things that you can do are to actually come back and hike or go for, long walks and keep yourself below a certain threshold with your heart rate so you are staying in that fat burning zone. But again, it's like relative from one person to the next. So somebody who's a beginner, and somebody just asked me this on Instagram today, is hiking zone 2? Can I hike? Can I do zone 2 for as long as I want to, if it's low level? And I'm like, don't know. Like, it depends. Somebody going for zone 2 for an hour could be the same feel to someone else like they've gone 3 hours. If you've been used to 30 minutes and now you're going an hour, you just doubled everything, and the workload and the stress, even if it was at a low level, that potentially is not something you'd want to do on a regular basis. So there's lots of factors here. The thing to remember, I put this in You Still Got It Girl when I wrote it in 2015, but it is decades old information. A small percentage of big number can still be more than a big percent of a small number. So it's not the exercise time alone that you want to focus on. HIIT is a bigger post-exercise burn. Keep that in mind for the repair and the recovery. And similarly, if you were doing something really long, you went for a 3 or 4 hour hike, or you were doing long endurance running, that is more stressful. It takes much more recovery time. So if you're stressed, the HIIT imposed stress may be too much, especially during adrenal or chronic fatigue. And if situational life stressors, emotional stressors are high, the intensity of exercise should potentially be reduced to reduce cortisol impact and the inflammation first before ever adding HIIT. So it is really helpful for you to kind of be this sounding board for your client, because it's non-intuitive. They may feel like, I've got to stay on track and I use this to negate my stress, but they will fail to see actually continuing to do the same thing as if they're not under other kinds of stressors will backfire on them. For most women, zone 2 is walking, but not jogging. For the reasons I just described, you're going to start jogging. The heart rate is going to come higher than you want it to. And unless you have a huge base of foundation, you're used to running and you've tested, not predicted. All right. So it's impossible to keep the heart rate low for a lot of women and low enough to be training in zone 2 while running. Even if you feel good or your client does, if the cardiac drift is enough, you're now in zone 3. And that means your cortisol is elevated. Not much positive is happening. The only people who should really train in zone 3 are those people who are training for tempo runs and they're doing like half marathon distance, because that is a stressful distance. If you're going a marathon and, not a lot of people are, again, not encouraging that, but you're going at a slower pace for a long time, at least when you're doing your training. Even if you're trying to get a better time, longer you go, the lighter the load or the intensity level should be. Zone 2 training for menopause can't ignore the fact that women already burn more fat compared to men at any given intensity level exercise. And that may be the exercise that supports greater insulin sensitivity. And that's problematic for women in menopause. At a lower level exercise, and that HIIT positively influences post-exercise fat oxidation. So we've got both of them. Like there's advantages to both, but again, it's like you cannot just slap this up and say, you're in midlife, so you should do low for this reason, and you should do HIIT for this reason. That would be great if we were all the same and we were all at the same energy level and we weren't, some of us, going through caregiving and career changes or relationship changes and financial issues. But we're all different. There's similarities across the board for sure, but we are all different, and how we are responding to that is different. So you as a trainer or a health coach, you are instrumental in helping her decide where you at right now. What are your signs and your symptoms? And even though these are your signs and your symptoms, let's not negate the fact that these things that you're doing, these potentially do have the ability to be very stressful. So let's keep watching. You're doing great right now. Signs and symptoms wise, you seem to be responding, but let's just keep collecting the clues. Don't ignore on a daily basis any little changes, because we can pivot immediately. That's so very important. So we don't want to put them in a box, anybody, and say, okay, only do this, because right now you should be very stressed, because then she will be. Don't tell them that, right? But you do want to be there and be the sounding board and just say, look, for anybody else, this would be really stressful. So you're responding really well. That tells me you've got really good stress coping skills. You have people to rely on. You feel like you're supported and things are going great. But let's just be prepared to keep a little bit more balance, maybe put in a little bit more rest and recovery, and we'll be ready for it if it shows up. And if it doesn't, fantastic, right? So if your client, your midlife client, has exercise intolerance, this is something I talked about at the What, When, and Why to Exercise for Women 40 and Over. And I actually had one of the key researchers, and Larati, was on the study about exercise intolerance, or a study, discussing it regarding menopausal women, and she had to back out at the last minute. She was I think it was her employer. She worked for a hospital and a university academic hospital, and they just felt like if she came on, even though there were other experts on who also just freewheeling talk and do an interview, she was worried that it would be interpreted as an exercise prescription and recommendations or advice. And I think she just was new to the whole model, and the ability to simply talk as if you're going on the news. But I spoke of the research, the primary research that she did in light of the fact that she just wasn't willing to, not even to do a podcast. So, and perfectly fine and great deal of respect, but I think she was caught up with a hospital system, a hospital legality, and lots of worry about litigation as opposed to education, unfortunately. So, if you want to learn more about exercise intolerance and menopause fitness, you can check out the Flipping 50 Menopause Fitness Specialist. And that's flipping50.com/specialist. And what I'd like for you to do too is to consider, looking up exercise intolerance. It has to do with your endothelial lining of the heart and blood vessels, and those are affected. And for a lot of women, it's like, I never had a label for that, but it happened to me. And I can say that it did for me. So there's no surprise. That wasn't just a coincidence that I stumbled across that, because nobody else talks about it, but it's what happened now that I can look back. I didn't know it, but we want other young women to know things like this, that this can very easily happen. A woman often feels like it's my fault, like I don't know how it got so out of shape, but this literally happened to me while I was training for an Ironman and kind of hit menopause and a lot of stressors, but the major stressor for me was the physiological stress that I was dealing with doing exercise that I was very attuned and adapted to. And suddenly it didn't work. And oddly enough, I moved from altitude to Phoenix, where things should have gotten easier. And they did not. And that was a major slap in the face. So, all right. So let me talk just once into this and that question that may linger for you. What about strength training and zone 2 training? Okay. Traditionally, we don't think of weight training as zone intensities using heart rate to tell intensity, right? But number of repetitions to fatigue and the volume in terms of multiple sets, say 1 versus 3 or 3 versus 4, and not time. At least that's what I hope. That's not true based on questions from clients. I still get, how long should a workout be? And I still hear exercise experts say, and the workout should be between 30 and 40 minutes long, or I read this like at a Mayo Clinic site. And I think, why? Why do you say that? Because you can get a great strength training workout in 10 minutes. And that 30 to 40-minute workout could be terrible. It could be a lack of volume in any one exercise or muscle group. It could be that you're using too light a weight to actually reach muscular fatigue. I mean, you all know these classes. You go to classes for an hour long and you may not have actually gotten enough stimulus. And, many of you who are trainers or health coaches may have come or may be fitness instructors. This happens. You're in front, you're leading a class. You may be reaching muscular fatigue, but look around in the back of the room. Are they? Do they even know what weight to pick up? It's a little loosey-goosey. And so we have to really look at that. Your heart rate will soar during a set, especially if it's a compound set like squats or lunges. Your evaluation there is based on reaching muscular fatigue in recommended repetitions, though, for intensity. Beginners start with more reps, not less. And you've got to show some love and respect to joints and ligaments before strength training will help you, to love your muscle and your body composition. I think we have to remind women of that yes, they're going to ask, what's the best thing to do for fat loss in terms of strength training? What's the best thing to do for more lean muscle? What's the best thing to do for bone density? And you want to tell them that, yes, but you want to say, but not today. Where are you right now? We don't want you to jump in and do that, even as a beginner. And it might mean that you're picking up a lighter weight compared to somebody advanced. I would never start a beginner doing 5 reps. And yet, ultimately, it's what I'd want is 5 sets, 5 reps for bone density, if that is specifically the goal. And yet not every day for 3 months, because we have to also decrease the risk of injury. And by imposing other kinds of stressors, sometimes lighter, sometimes more moderate weight, and then also the heavy weight, we're going to get better results than if we just try to go heavy. We're going to reach a plateau, but we're also going to risk the ligaments, the connective tissue, which is exactly what we don't want to alienate those. Okay, so there you have it. So a little discussion on zone 2. Bottom line, is zone 2 training for menopause really ideal, or is it like a pillar of what should be? I think what you really want to talk to them about is more or less walking. You're getting very low level activity. So if we don't have to label it zone 2, where they're going to wonder, where should my heart rate be? Instead, you talk to them in terms of talking. How does that feel? Like you're able to talk in complete sentences, and you decide when you're done. You're not done because you're exhausted, you can't go anymore. And you feel like you could do it again. And when you're finished, you have more energy for the rest of the day. This is zone 2, right? And you tell them this is nose and mouth breathing. Much of it nose breathing. You can walk, close your mouth, and be just fine. That's zone 2. When you start getting into zone 3, now it becomes mouth and nose. Like let me make sure I restated that correctly, by the way. So nose breathing is zone 2. You're still in that point where you can close your mouth and you can breathe deeply through your nose alone. When you start needing to take a deeper breath and you vacillate maybe a little bit between nose and mouth, that begins to be zone 3. You've reached that point. So it's kind of that crossing over the aerobic threshold. And then it's that point between there and like, I can't go any higher, or I go harder, I go faster, or against more resistance, I can't elevate my heart rate anymore. That's your second threshold, right? Between those 2 points is really, quote unquote, your exercise induced stress. I hope this was helpful, kind of to unpack zone 2, the confusion over fat burning. This is not the goal. The reason it's successful for so many people is not because they're burning more fat for fuel at a very slow rate. It's because they're decreasing their stress levels. They're not imposing high intensity exercise stress, and they're moving their bodies, hopefully while also doing strength training on other days or same day of the week, a couple times a week, so that now when they go for walks, they're more positively improving their blood sugar levels. Keeping blood sugar down keeps insulin levels down. Cortisol and insulin then no longer team up to deposit belly fat. That is actually the biggest benefit. Blood sugar control, decreasing cortisol. If you've got cortisol, what's happening? You are breaking down your muscle, and nothing good happens when you break down muscle. You want to keep that relationship with muscle very strong. Okay, what are you waiting for? The world needs you right now more than ever to start dispelling some of these myths about training, physical training during menopause. And you'll find today's show notes at fitnessmarketingmastery/zone 2, the number zone 2 training for menopause. What are you waiting for? Let's start changing the world and improving the fitness industry together.